Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So, welcome back yet again for, oh, okay, yes, now lighting. For the next lecture in our New South Meets Global South series. So our lecturer today is Reiko Hillyer, and she is coming to us. Oh, I need to zoom out a little bit here. Thanks. Okay. She is coming to us from Lewis and Clark College, where she is an associate professor of history and department chair and the director of ethnic studies. She has a BA in political science from Yale University and a PhD in history from Columbia University. Her specialty is the US South, so she's in a good place. African-American history, the built environment, and prison studies. Her first book, called Designing Dixie, Tourism, Memory, and Urban Space in the New South, explores how tourism in the American South after the Civil War helped to foster a public memory of the war that would help smooth sectional reconciliation, usher in industrial capitalism, and legitimate Jim Crow. She's published scholarly work on the civil rights movement and public memory, community policing in New York City, and prison litigation in Virginia. She's also been teaching a program called the Inside Out program, where undergraduate students from the university are part of the class, and then incarcerated inmates are also part of the class, and they meet and study together. And she's recently completed her latest book project called A Wall is Just a Wall, that was influenced by that program. And she was recently, about a week ago, I think, interviewed on CNN about that project. So her work has been supported by the American Philosophical Society, the Vital Projects Fund, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So please join me in welcoming Reiko Hillyer.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Hello, it's such a great crowd, and I'm hoping that with this dim light that you're not going to fall asleep, okay? You're with me so far? I haven't lost you yet, I hope. Thank you to Blaine and Nadia and Emily, whom I met this morning, and Tina and Willie. I don't know if you know these people, but I'm holding them in my heart because I had the most wonderful conversations about the exciting things that are going on your campus. And I'm just honored to have been part of this lecture series. And I just want to explain where I'm coming from, because I understand you've had lots of practitioners here, and I want to be really distinct and explicit about what it is that I have to offer, hopefully the perspective that I bring to the kinds of things you've been thinking about. So I'm a social and cultural historian of the built environment. So I'm not a practitioner. I'm thinking about the ways in which the physical environment both reflects and shapes social relations. And I like to think about the built environment as a historical text. So if we do history, we often read historical evidence. Often that evidence is written, but evidence is also all around us in 3 dimensions, because after all, history takes place, right? It takes place in place, and the physical landscapes around us are kind of palimpsests, right? They can offer us layers and evidence of the past. And so I'm just sort of sharing with you some of the things that I've been thinking about lately, especially since the George Floyd protests have really brought to the fore, I think, into the mainstream conversation, the politics of public memory on the landscape. So that's what I'm thinking about with you today. And I need to find a keyboard so that I can move on forward. So if you'll indulge me, there's some portions of this that I feel more comfortable reading, and so I may be doing that. But hopefully also I will be able to gaze into your beautiful eyes. Okay, so I'm opening here. Am I able to move forward? No. Oh, how do I move the slide forward? I'm just pushing the arrow. Click the mouse and then move thank you. Can you try flicking the mouse? Brilliant, thank you. All right, So this is a cartoon by an incredibly prolific and important cartoonist, Thomas Nast. I don't know if any of you have seen his work. He was a German-born American editorial cartoonist who created the modern image of Santa Claus. And this cartoon is really about the power of monuments and memory. And it's called Patience on a Monument. And this monument is set within the context of the White South's violent campaign to reverse Reconstruction, which, as you know, was the short-lived radical experiment in interracial democracy that established citizenship and enfranchisement to millions of people after the Civil War. This statue figures a hypothetical Black soldier with several layers of irony. The soldier is seated, he is downcast, and he is powerless in the face of the violence all around him. And on the monument column, there is a quotation from a senator from Missouri, and you'll excuse my language, it is his language, not mine. And now I say that unless the Negroes submit to the intelligent guidance of the powerful white race, their fate will be that of the Indians. They will be exterminated. The Negroes can only be happy and prosperous as long as they are guided by the intelligence of the white race. With this hypothetical monument in 1868, Thomas Nast raises the question of what the legacy of the Civil War will be. He understood that the Union's military victory was hollow if the postbellum order was not characterized by a commitment to a new birth of freedom. And his cartoon demonstrates what Frederick Douglass knew in 1882, quote, "Verily, the work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins." The cartoon also reminds us that monuments matter because memory matters. We all know the words of George Orwell: "Those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future." And we're probably familiar with this quotation, but I would like to parse it out a little bit in the context of the New South. Those who control the present control the past. In the case of Confederate monuments, what was the present in which these monuments were erected? I'm sure many of you know these were not just monuments to the dead erected right after the Civil War, but a generation later, in the 1890s, after former secessionists regained control of Southern governments, to create a mythic past that would legitimate the present, which was characterized by a violent counter-revolution against Reconstruction. And this myth, you probably know, so this is maybe review, is the lost cause myth, right? This was a myth that took hold of the nation, providing a kind of conceptual glue for segregation and disfranchisement, terrorism that persists to this day. By romanticizing the Confederate cause in public space, these monuments legitimized Jim Crow and were a physical reminder of who was in charge. Sort of challenging the old axiom that history is written by the winners. In this case, the losers won with the pen, with the marble, and the lynch mob. I'm quoting historian David Blight here. What they could not win on the battlefield, the cause of white supremacy and the dominant understanding of what the war was about. So to make the point in a more general way, and I'm sure this is not news to you, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page to start. Memorialization tells us more about the period in which the memorialization occurred than about the events being memorialized. We need to understand the context in which a monument was erected to appreciate its intent. Now let's take the second part of George Orwell's quote: "Those who control the past control the future." The lost cause version of the Civil War was a myth, but myths have material consequences. How we have remembered and commemorated the Civil War has determined the very fate of democracy in this country. Because if slavery is remembered as benevolent, then Americans of African descent cannot be perceived as equal citizens. If slavery is seen as incidental rather than central to the Civil War, then its eradication in all of its forms would not be a commitment in the war's aftermath. If Confederates are revered as noble patriots rather than traitors, then their power could be quickly restored. If Reconstruction was an act of federal tyranny on a prostrate white South, then federal intervention would not be tolerated as an essential measure to protecting Black citizens from terrorism, disfranchisement, and economic subjugation. And so what became the dominant memory of the past helped to solidify the development of a racist apartheid in the US for another century. One need only consider what would happen to the future of the United States if history books remember the election of Joe Biden as stolen and illegitimate. What would happen if Black Lives Matter protesters are remembered as terrorists? How would such narratives prophesy for the future of democracy? These are not paranoid considerations, as we now too well recall that in Charlottesville in 2017, white nationalists gravitated precisely towards Confederate monuments and Confederate symbols as rallying points for their cause. In Charlottesville, when they chanted, "You will not replace us," Jews will not replace us, this was a pledge to maintain their privilege and power, an expression of their desire to take our country back, quote unquote. They were echoing the cries of white supremacists over a century ago who erected those very monuments. So again, those who determine the past shape the future. And if the future is now, we can see the poisonous nature of what might otherwise be just considered an antiquarian fetish. Just one more point about what effect monuments from the lost cause can have on memory as a material fact of the landscape. While the erection of these monuments to express a clear ideological message, because they are placed in public spaces and set in stone, they come to be seen as natural and even innocuous, which has the effect of normalizing views that have been and should be contested. In his observations on the urban environment of the early 20th century, Austrian philosopher Robert Musil wrote that, quote, "The most striking feature of monuments is that you don't notice them. There is nothing in the world as invisible as a monument. Like a drop of water on an oilskin, attention runs down them without stopping for a moment," unquote. But the not noticing is the privilege and the reward of those in power. Black people always noticed. My friend Calvin Duncan, an American of African descent who was incarcerated at Angola prison in Louisiana for 25 years, told me that many of his fellow prisoners were tried at a courthouse that had a Confederate monument and Confederate flag flying over it. And he emphasized that it was not a coincidence that 80% of the 6,000 people at Angola Penitentiary are Black. According to a local activist there, Hersey Jones, these symbols, quote, "contaminated every case involving African Americans in that courthouse." Memorials have a way of establishing a sense of permanence and universal values, but those values are neither universal nor permanent, and that is our job, right, to interrogate them. So let me just think, sorry, that was supposed to be up the whole time. Robert E. Lee, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So let's just think about a timeline for a second, all right? I want to just highlight here the time in which most of the Confederate monuments went up, right? The 1890s. A generation after the Nast cartoon, the Southern landscape would indeed be punctuated by hundreds of monuments, not monuments celebrating the liberation of 4 million people or the expansion of democratic rights to former slaves, but monuments to the defeated Confederacy. These monuments were not erected only to memorialize the past, but to legitimate the transition to a Jim Crow present. And so we can see that it's very significant that the moment that these monuments are erected is not right after the Civil War. They are not as much expressions of mourning the dead, but part of a counter-revolution against Reconstruction made in mortar and stone. So this Robert E. Lee statue is also part of constructing a new South, right? This was actually erected on a series of boulevards. Some of you are familiar with Monument Boulevard, constructed in the 1890s to sort of emulate European styles known as the Beaux-Arts or the City Beautiful, right? But in fact, when the statue was erected, it was in the middle of a tobacco field. It was on the margins of Richmond. It was meant as a lure for real estate development to ensure future white elites who might move out to what was then the suburbs, that this was going to be a monumental and genteel landscape. All right. So in this case, Confederate monuments are directly serving a New South promise of property accumulation and genteel urban order. And you can see here, monument annex lots at original prices, right? So this is based on some of the work of art historian Kirk Savage. I've got to credit my sources. And we, again, have a synchronicity between a valorization and nostalgia for the Old South and the New South values of progressive urban development and capital accumulation. You can see here a kind of effort to extend the gentility of a new middle class out into what had been a largely rural landscape. And so putting the monuments there are part of ordering the space and also an expression of a new social order. There are other kinds of monuments I want to just highlight here, including the trope of the loyal slave, the loyal mammy, or other forms of romanticizing slavery. And I was just told today that this monument has been taken down in December, which is quite extraordinary. It was extraordinary that it was up to begin with, a monument to the Confederacy in the National Cemetery. Right, Confederacy specifically enacted treason, right, by leaving the Union and starting a war. And so the fact that this is sort of nationalized is significant. But what I want to bring your attention to is this fictive image of the loyal slave, right? The mammy figure, quote unquote, who is going to loyally hold down the home front for her enslaver and be entrusted with the care of her children. So in 1914, there's already a nostalgia for an old imagined harmonious relationship with enslaved people. This one, Uncle Jack, went up in 1927. All of this a kind of hortatory or wishful thinking, right? A projection onto the past of a good old days, right? That suggests a kind of lamentation of older forms of racist hierarchy. But it's important too to recognize that there was always a counter narrative. Afro-Americans throughout the nation engaged in their own commemorative activities. With emancipation, Southern Black people gained the capacity to celebrate their history in ways that had been impossible during slavery. And they grasped this opportunity and they worked to establish a commemorative tradition of their own. Black communities engaged in memorial activities in the form of parades, such as this one in Richmond, Virginia, and did so as a statement of public representation, performing rituals that would become critical to political mobilization and solidarity. Theirs was an effort to push back against the power of the lost cause interpretation of history, as well as pushing back on the domination of public space by white people due to segregation. Often these remembrances took the form of parades and ceremonies because Afro-Americans did not have the money to erect stone monuments, but understood that by entering public spaces with their bodies and performing communal pageantry, they were trying to incorporate Black history into the region's civic culture. And white Southerners were very aware of the power of such rituals. White observers were appalled at Black people taking over public space, and they closed their shutters and mocked the celebrations of people as ridiculous or vulgar or even dangerous. Sometimes they harassed the revelers until they dispersed. White Southerners expressed resentment and derision towards Black commemorative spectacles because they understood that these rituals of remembrance represented a form of cultural resistance to white authority and a disruption of their desired social order. According to historian Fitz Brundage, quote, "For all the efforts of Southern whites to enshrine their historical understanding of slavery, the Civil War, and Black capacities, Black celebrations made manifest a forceful and enduring understanding of their own. Postbellum Blacks, no less than whites, appreciated the power that flowed from the recalled past." And I just want to highlight again here, in terms of our conversation in the space of architecture, that if one of the main ways that people control other people is through their access to space, then laying claim to space becomes an incredibly significant political act. So that might not have a lasting evidence in stone, right? But it's a performative space that depends on the dimensionality of the space for it to have power, right? You're entering into space, into a forbidden space with your bodies. In 1890, when the Lee Monument went up, Black journalist and a newspaper editor in Richmond, John Mitchell, complained that the dedication of the statue handed down a legacy of blood. He was not afraid to say so. And here he says in his newspaper, the Negro was in the northern processions on Decoration Day, and in the southern ones, if only to carry buckets of ice water. He put up the Lee Monument, and should the time come, he will be there to take it down. An extraordinary statement demonstrating the incredible symbolism of the monument, not only to the lost cause, but to the labor of the people who propped it up, and that the people who were going to take it down were going to be Black people themselves. So, to review, the lost cause memorialization emerges as part of a counter-revolution against Reconstruction, during which Afro-Americans had gained political power that has not been matched since. The triumph of Jim Crow was a robbery of rights gained and a restoration of white supremacy. Let us return to our timeline and notice the next little blip. And maybe you can think about why there might be a little peak in the second wave of monument building and the popularity of the Confederate flag right around the 1950s and 60s. Does anyone want to guess? Okay, this is the moment marked by the freedom struggle or the second Reconstruction, when once again, white Southerners felt their supremacy was under attack by the civil rights movement and its achievements. The Confederate flag as we know it, which had been largely forgotten for the previous 100 years after the Civil War, except at veterans events and battle commemorations, was first unfurled in its current form at the Democratic Convention in 1948, when Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party and started the Dixiecrat Party to protest Truman and Northern Democrats' vague support of civil rights. It was used to protest precisely against the civil rights movement. I should issue a trigger warning for showing the Confederate flag. I apologize, trigger warning. The flag became increasingly popular as a rejoinder to Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. That's why you see the little peak. When Georgia began to insert the flag into its state flag in 1956, when state commissioners passed the resolution to change their state flag, it stated, this is in Georgia, that Brown was, quote, an affront and a challenge to the traditions of our people, and this association and its members pledged to protect and maintain the segregation of the races in our schools. Okay? They are literally using the Confederate flag to express this. They did not mention Confederacy once, or even states' rights. South Carolina put the flag above its capital for the first time in 1962. These gestures were acts of defiance against the social movements and federal policies pushing for racial equality, or pushing for, I should say, democracy. Such gestures were not fringe or fragmented, but coalesced in the forms of citizens' councils, which were organizations throughout the South that spearheaded a campaign known as massive resistance. In this case, massive resistance refers to conservative resistance, the mission of which was to simply refuse to desegregate public schools in defiance of court orders. The leaders of massive resistance drew upon the theory of John C. Calhoun, whose ideas of interposition were the bulwark of the states' rights defense of slavery and secession itself. Now, there is a trigger warning for the next image. It is a recent image of the use of Confederate flag. Sorry, that wasn't it, but it's this one, Dylann Roof. Painful evidence of the power of the past, even a fictive past, over the present, is the case of Dylann Roof, the young man who murdered Afro-American parishioners at a historic Charleston church. Whoops, what did I do? Oh no. Oh no. My touch was wait, laptop, doc cam, power, lamp, zoom in, capture. Anyway, this doesn't involve an image, so I'm just going to talk. I hope that's all right because we're doing serious work here. Yeah, it's meant to be blank. Good, thank you. Right, so Roof wanted to start a race war, and he displayed the Confederate flag, as you saw in that picture, which I do not want to have remaining over my head. But even more pointedly for our purpose is in his manifesto, he drew upon an interpretation of history to argue that segregation, quote, was not a bad thing. It was a defensive measure. It existed to protect us from them. It protected us from being brought down to their level. I can't read this anymore. I'm going to skip the rest of his words, but he refers to raping women and needing to eliminate people during his shooting spree. This is the same sentiment that animated the lynchings and massacres that characterized Jim Crow. And in his manifesto, he expressed the same nostalgia for the past that his Confederate heroes did, and he drew strength from it. He said, quote, "Some people feel as though the South is beyond saving, that we have too many Black people here. To this I say, look at history. The South had a higher ratio of Blacks when we were holding them as slaves." He's saying if we were able to subjugate them before, why not today? In other words, we can make America great again. Strikingly, in the aftermath of Dylann Roof, many of the states of the former Confederacy circled the proverbial wagons around their sacred symbols. And I'm sure you recall, some of you, that North Carolina adopted a law in 2015 prohibiting the removal of Confederate statues without the approval of a heavily Republican state legislature. In 2017, after residents of Birmingham, Alabama, who are predominantly Black, urged the removal of Confederate monuments, Alabama passed the Memorial Preservation Act, which forbids the relocation of any architecturally significant memorial that has been in place for over 40 years without state permission. So to be clear, in the aftermath of Roof's massacre, anticipating that their lost cause mythology would be under fire, the neo-Confederates doubled down on their commitment to it. But now I want to think about, along with you, those signs and symbols that are not as obvious as a Confederate flag or memorial. Those symbols that are domesticated and commodified, made even more normalized and invisible because of their mundaneness. Their ideological insistence might even be that much more powerful. Think about a suburban subdivision that's named after the plantation that used to be there. Consider the phenomenon of people getting married at plantations, as though this is nothing but a beautiful pastoral setting. Consider the phenomenon of old slave cabins being turned into Airbnbs, and wonder what kind of history is communicated when a guest stays there to find a mint on their pillow. These are all examples of what Antonio Gramsci might talk about, might call hegemony, right? You all know that word. These kinds of structures are key tools in the idea of hegemony, the process by which people accept the legitimacy of the current order without the necessity of much violent enforcement. We grant that ideological assumption a kind of grudging acceptance as a fact of life. That's just the way things are. But in the aftermath of the 2020 protests and the national reckoning it aimed to urge, some people did begin finally to raise the crucial question of whether or not there was an important difference between the symbolism of monuments and the material structure of society. And I think of the great historian Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who writes in the aftermath of the protests, the main federal legislation to emerge from the rebellions and protests of the summer of 2020 has not been for police reform or in the establishment of comprehensive new programs intended to improve the life chances of Black people. It has been the establishment of Juneteenth, a new national holiday to commemorate when federal troops arrived in Texas and freed the enslaved. This kind of national celebration of the symbolic while leaving undisturbed the architecture of oppression that has made African Americans disproportionately vulnerable to premature death and a travestied freedom, has been a hallmark of the Black experience since the abolition of slavery. So I want to just unpack a little bit this idea of the architecture of oppression. While I sympathize deeply with Taylor's critique, I also am coming to understand that key to present-day social structures is that their seeming intransigence, their seeming inevitability and unchangeability is cemented in part by how we inscribe historical narratives into the physical landscape. The built environment is where collective memory is stored and preserved. Historian Max Page says collective memory is literally constructed. In other words, the built environment are the material touchstones for recollection. I don't have to tell architecture students that the built landscape is a pedagogical tool, right? It teaches things, it conveys values. That making the landscape actually produces a way of knowing. So if the current social order is held up by the glue of historical narrative, then the visual markers of that narrative are what cue its legitimacy and make that legitimacy concrete in everyday life. In other words, the symbol is the structure. The material structure both reflects and enacts a society's hegemonic ideology. A successful definition of ideology, or a succinct definition of a successful ideology, might be that it convinces people that a particular interpretation of society is natural and unalterable. As a scholar of the built environment, then, I look at all landscapes, not just the monumental ones. Deliberate memorials to history are only one form of codifying racism in the landscape. Only, if again, one of the main ways that people have sought to control other people is by controlling their access to space, and restricting access to that space then creates conditions that made and continues to make racial inequality seem like common sense, then, in other words, space helps make race. Think about the expression, know your place. One need only think about how plantations themselves have been spatially organized to cognize the very way that the plantation was supposed to operate, right? The way a plantation is organized, obviously, is an idealization, but it is an arrangement of space that instantiates relations of power and reinforces ideas about racial difference. One only needs to think of the physical movement through a plantation landscape, the way in which it is meant to inspire awe and a kind of sense of the dominance over the landscape, but also how that memory in the tourist landscape has altered history over time. So, for example, back in the day, Boone Hall Plantation, if you were to go down that path, you'd see the slave cabins on the side. Okay? And again, this arrangement was very much on purpose to demonstrate to any visitor that this was a generous, benevolent enslaver, right? Who could show off his mastery over all of his dependents and his mastery over the natural world. That story is erased, right? Domesticated, euthanized, or euphemized, I should say, in the current tourist landscape. One thinks again of Monument Avenue and the ways in which this was not just a commemorative landscape that told a particular story of the Civil War, but it was literally a white supremacist segregationist landscape with promises in the advertisements that no lots can ever be sold or rented in Monument Avenue Park to any person of African descent. Right? So how we order physical space is going to reproduce ideas about race and naturalize them so that they are common sense. Obviously, you're familiar with the iconic images of segregation, and water fountains, for some reason, have become the metonymy of segregationist policies. But I chose this particular one because it helps us understand how segregation also affects people on the level of the human body, right? In order to have a drink at the colored water fountain, one has to wait for someone at the white fountain to finish. In order to drink from the colored water fountain, you have to bend down lower. Right? There's a choreography to Jim Crow that gets in the skin, that turns into an embodiment, right, of the physical space. So how to move through the physical space starts to become as relevant, right? That is the test against which your life or death might hinge. And you're probably all familiar with the federal practice of redlining, right? Of identifying neighborhoods that are filled with people of African descent or immigrants, or even neighborhoods that are mixed, okay, as intrinsically high-risk, infested neighborhoods that are derelict and therefore do not deserve any kind of investment. So the federal government instantiates racial difference into the physical landscape, and by doing so makes it economically rational for white homeowners to disavow possible Black neighbors, right? They don't have to be hateful human beings to see with the religion of property values conflicts with the promises of democracy. And we think about, too, other forms of violence and power on the physical landscape through the example of urban renewal, which you're no doubt familiar. Highways cutting through Black neighborhoods in an effort to disperse and maybe kill the village in order to save it. Highways are a certain kind of hostile architecture, but we also have new forms of hostile architecture. I don't know how many of you have seen this kind of thing. Have any of you seen this kind of thing? Like random, do you know what they are and what they're meant for? Yeah, so these are all over Portland. These boulders are meant to prevent people who are houseless, people who are outside the real estate market, to prevent them from camping there, right? So these are mean. This is mean, right? This is what we mean by hostile architecture. And this, of course, is a war on public space and a war on the public. This idea is not new. I borrow from Mike Davis, among others, right? The idea that a bench should be made so uncomfortable that you cannot sit on it, right? But again, thinking about the least of us and the all of us of it all, right? This is something that harms not only people who are houseless and may need to sleep somewhere, but anyone with a child, anyone with groceries, anyone who is infirm, anyone who is elderly, right? Keep moving, keep moving. You are not welcome here. In a park in a gentrifying neighborhood of Washington, D.C., they've removed the benches altogether. So when I'm thinking about the built environment, I'm not just thinking about the works of great architects, right? I'm looking at vernacular space and thinking about the politics of the everyday landscape, what messages and what material consequences it shapes for our community. Here is another example of hostile architecture. Probably the most hostile architecture is arguably the prison, especially the supermax, which is designed specifically to be hostile. And this was the result of all kinds of policies, which I can't talk about here and can later if anyone is interested. But the policies that led us to mass incarceration also led us to a belief in meaner conditions within prisons. And accompanying the higher rates of incarceration for greater numbers of offenses for longer periods of time was also a movement that scholars have called the penal harm movement. The ethic that people who are incarcerated, it's not enough punishment to remove them from society and put them in isolation. They have to be in a remote or rural area, and they have to be in a physical environment that is austere and hard and miserable. And that was a purposeful argument that has been made in the past several decades. This also involves, of course, the separation of individual humans into increasingly common. Solitary confinement is increasingly common. At San Quentin prison, people in solitary confinement get a chance to exercise for 1 hour a day in a space that looks like this. So they are surrounded by gray. They are surrounded by cold, a combination of sensory deprivation and sensory assault, all in an effort to, again, naturalize the idea that these folks are so irredeemable that they have to be removed and they have to be tortured. And they are made invisible, right? And when they're made invisible, it's easier to demonize them. But again, there is always resistance. Leah Borromeo has done a little performance piece intervening with her mattress. This is her anti-homeless spikes project in London. And here is an intervention by a French artist named JR, who created a composite mural of people who were incarcerated and recently freed from Tehachapi prison in California. And from an aerial view, you can imagine all of the bodies inside. And there was an app that went along with it. And if you listen to the app, you were able to hear people's voices and stories, right? This is an insistence that people who are made invisible remain human, that they want to be part of the human community, and that we need people like artists and designers to bridge the gap between those we have disposed of and those of us who want to reach them. Other sorts of interventions, in my view, have been a little less successful. This is the monument to Arthur Ashe, which was meant to be a kind of multicultural answer to the otherwise offensiveness of the Confederate heroes on Monument Avenue. But again, this is kind of a saccharine, sort of apolitical view, right, of Arthur Ashe. He is a champion tennis player who for most of his life wasn't allowed to play or enter any of the country clubs in Richmond. And here he is almost looking like a diminutive old man with books in one hand, you know, surrounded by children. Maybe he looks like he's about to throw the books on their head. I don't know. But of all the statues on Confederate Monument Avenue, this is the one that still remains up. Another intervention, of course, is to take these monuments down, right? But then there's still other conversations to be had in space. The work of Kehinde Wiley, the artist and portrait painter from Los Angeles. Here he is in Rumors of War, referencing the work of old masters. He was the one who was commissioned to paint a portrait of President Obama in 2017 for the Smithsonian. And here in Rumors of War, he has constructed something that's a direct response to the Confederate memorials along Monument Avenue. First, this was up in Times Square, but it was eventually commissioned by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Here's a close-up, and you can see that he is using you know, following the style of equestrian portraiture, especially the monument to Jeb Stuart, repeating its posture and repeating its materials, but also creating a new kind of figure, right? A contemporary Black man in a hoodie. The title, Rumors of War, specifically refers to a biblical passage from the book of Matthew in the New Testament that speaks to the rebirth of the downtrodden in the face of oppression. Wiley himself states, the inspiration for Rumors of War is war and engagement with violence. Art and violence have for an eternity held a strong narrative grip with each other. Rumors of War attempts to use the language of equestrian portraiture to both embrace and subsume our fetishization of state violence. New York and Times Square in particular sit at the crossroads of human movement on a global scale. So to have the Rumors of War sculpture presented in such a context lays bare the scope and scale of the project and its conceit to expose the beautiful and terrible potentiality of art to sculpt the language of domination. There has also been human intervention that is embodied and interactive and experiential. Here is the work of This Place Matters. This is Joseph McKill, McGill, he is the head and founder of something he calls the Slave Dwelling Project, whose slogan is changing the narrative. McGill's ancestors were enslaved in South Carolina, and he has decided that by the simple act of sleeping in former slave quarters, first alone and then with other people, could start a conversation that could reckon with the past. By 2020, he has held 150 sleepovers with campfire discussions about slavery, its legacy, and historical trauma. He's slept in more than 70 dwellings in 14 states, sometimes with the descendants of slaves, sometimes with the descendants of slave owners. Another intervention that is embodied and experiential is the work of this Black Youth Project at the Marion Sims Monument. Thanks to the work of historians, it has become clear that the father of modern gynecology, Marion Sims, did most of his experiments on enslaved women. And so this is a protest to tell that story, to counter the narrative of heroicism, and also to put their bodies in place as the monuments themselves, right? The idea of the body as a monument. Obviously, graffiti is a way of intervening, and in Richmond, before this monument was taken down, using this pedestal to project other images of other heroes, other people who deserve monuments, became a thing, as the young people say. But I'm going to turn now to Portland, just to think about, even though this is not in the South, one of the things that I've come to recognize as an historian of the South is that the South does have its exceptional qualities. And as a historian, I have to think about the specificity of each region in time, right? And yet the South is very much part of the national story, that the North was complicit in the Southern economy, that the North and the nation has benefited from the Southern economy, and that in many ways the South has been a template for landscapes throughout the nation and have reproduced and universalized the South. So I want to challenge its exceptionalism. This sign, this Jim Crow sign, "We cater to white trade," is from Portland, Oregon in the 1940s. And this is a response to a great wave of migrants from the American South of African descent, from states like Louisiana and Texas up to the shipyards to work in the war industries in the port of Portland. And so these signs started to go up, okay, in a city that had theretofore or heretofore, I don't know which word, not had that many Black people, okay? But seemingly overnight, the population of people of African descent went from 2,000 or something like this, 4,000 to 25, 30,000, okay? And there was a neighborhood, right, a red-lined neighborhood, a hemmed-in neighborhood that had been an immigrant neighborhood that became the heart and soul of Portland's Black community. But as often has happened in many neighborhoods around the United States, these neighborhoods were targeted as blighted and regarded as prime spaces through which highway construction, mall construction, stadium construction could be built, right? That those neighborhoods were precisely bled, right? They were not just neglected, they were specifically starved of any kind of capital or any kind of investment, right? With partnerships from the federal banking system to local real estate practices. And you could be, your building could be called blighted because it had a broken front step, And so this Russell and Williams Street was the intersection, the heart of the Black community. And in the 1950s and 60s, the entire area was basically razed to build highways and also to build malls and so forth. Albina, this neighborhood, had been home to 80% of Portland's Black population, but these policies of urban renewal displaced a number of families for the sake of improving the property values of others, right? Of investors, of businesses, of the commercial class. Memorial Coliseum was constructed where hundreds of Black homes used to be. Lloyd Center, which was one of the nation's first enclosed malls, was constructed where the neighborhood used to be, this effort to kind of bring suburban amenities into the city limits as an effort to stem white flight, right? Rather than sort of make home ownership accessible to more people. Here, these are from the Portland City Archives. These are some slides taken of some of the houses that had been demolished. And I just came across this recently, and I just thought it was quite lovely, not least because you can see them in color, right? The past took place in color, right? So iconic businesses, Black-owned businesses, such as Maxie's Barbershop here. If you like a good before and after, there is Maxie's, and this is what is there now. Again, this was not without protests. The Black Panthers and other city groups were protesting against urban renewal. In this picture in particular, they're protesting against the destruction of buildings for the sake of building a hospital extension. And you can see in the course of raising local buildings, the clinic they refer to, the clinic will continue, was the Fred Hampton Memorial Clinic. There was a Black Panthers medical clinic that was torn down in order to expand the hospital. And this great building, the corner of Russell and Williams, was torn down to build this hospital extension. You can see the cupola is being taken off, which this is now the lot, right? The thing was never built. And so there are families that are actually suing the city now for having been displaced for a project that never happened. And if it's some small measure of consolation, thinking about everyday monuments, that cupola has now been placed in a local park. So there is this sort of residual memory of the neighborhood that had been. But you will see what's happened as a result of urban renewal, highway building, the ways in which neighborhoods are completely eviscerated by freeway construction, asthma rates, depletion of resources for schools, so forth, that there's an outmigration of Black people and an in-migration of white people, which is, of course, what we call gentrification. So there is, and I'm just showing here the ways in which home values have gone up. This is, already 25 years old, but this is when one of the main transitions was taking place. The process from, quote, blight to desirable. So another intervention are individual community members like this fellow, Cleo Davis, who had the really interesting story of having a family, the long-standing family in Portland. His grandmother had purchased, with every spare bit that she could gather, a somewhat dilapidated building that had 7 apartments. And she was hoping that it could produce some revenue for her family. And the property ownership for the family in itself was already tremendous. For any Black family in the Pacific Northwest in the 1970s, tremendous. But she also had a family of kids that were electricians and contractors and carpenters, and she knew that she could count on them to repair the building and accrue some money for the rent. But within a couple of years of her purchasing the building, the city red tagged it. In other words, said that it was going to be demolished, that it was blighted, that they wanted to seize the building or they wanted to tear it down, and that the family could live in a small one bedroom house behind the building, but that building was blighted and had to go. It was just torn down and nothing was ever put in its place. And this main promise of income for sustainability of this family was taken away. So Cleo Davis is the grandson, and he had a very interesting maneuver. Down the street from the plot where his grandmother's apartment building had been was this house, the Mayo House, which was built in the 1890s, a Queen Anne style. It's one of the oldest houses still standing in Portland, and it's so valued that it's been moved a couple of times already. But there was this city move to move this house yet again, and a city discussion about where it should go and so on. So Cleo Davis decides to present himself in front of the city council, and he says, I would like to take this house, please. We are willing to have it on our property, and we expect you, the city, to pay for the move and to pay for all of the permits that it requires to change the zoning so that I can turn this into a museum. And you know why? Because the city stole my grandmother's building 2 blocks down, and now's your chance to repair the harm. And there was like whiplash in the city council because he was trying to turn a zoning question into a question of reparations for his family, and use this as an opportunity to say, I should be entitled to this property on my property, and you should pay for the move because you have engaged in plunder of my family. Right? And this has started a really interesting process that has begun a conversation about reparation in Portland. And another form of reparation concerns this whole area that was ripped out. And that is the Albina Vision Trust. And this is an effort to try to revitalize this neighborhood, but with Black families in mind, and in particular, tracking down the descendants of families who were displaced and actually giving them first priority to come back and benefit from this development. And I recognize that I'm running out of time, and I've been talking for a really long time. So I'm going to just say, I'm going to move here. All right. I want to just talk now about ruins to conclude. Are you with me? Ruins. Okay. So we were talking about various interventions on the commemorative landscape, and I want to think about this one. This is the empty pedestal, right? And what I like about it is that it captures the dynamism and conflict and multiple voices and the contestation and the layers and the change over time and sort of the instability of the moment. And I feel like this itself should be a monument, and I hope that somehow it is. But I also want to think of this as a ruin, right? A ruin of a Confederate monument. And I want us to think about ruins and what they might have to tell us about public memory and historical narrative. This is a ruin of an industrial landscape. This building in the back was a factory constructed in the 1920s that produced artificial silk and rayon, and it peaked during World War II, making fabric for parachutes or whatnot. But it also became like a pantyhose factory and employed 5,000 people, which was central to the economy of Bamberg. Eventually, textile mills moved from the American South to the global South, right? And then completely halfway around the world. And so, and then are replaced with these retailers that are selling those goods that are made halfway across the country, right? So here is a situation where we can read the layers of globalization physically in one space. And it's this kind of juxtaposition that I most appreciate for telling us the story of the United States. These are other industrial ruins. I'm going to skip over these. But what I wanted to think about, again, with ruins, is that there is this long tradition of ruins as romance, right? Ruins as some kind of evocation of nostalgia. But I started showing these pictures of ruins to an ethnic studies class. And this one in particular, which is, you know, about the deindustrialization and evisceration of Detroit's economy, and the kind of, you know, what some people call ruin porn photography that has emerged in response to sort of document and find the beauty in these spaces. And I showed this to my student, and I was like, you know, what do you make of this? And she said, am I supposed to feel sad? Is this tragic? Like, where's the loss here exactly? What am I supposed to be mourning? And it was a really interesting question, because she's like, am I mourning the shifts in industrial, like the demise of these particular robber barons? Am I mourning the fluctuations of capitalism? Like, what am I supposed to be feeling here? And so then I started thinking about the columns of factories and the ways in which these spaces are, you know, industrial ruins. But then I started thinking about the longer history of columns in the Old South. And I started thinking about columns and the lost cause, and sort of where is our memory of the lost cause in relationship to our memory of industrial decline? Like, how can we sort of put these different landscapes in conversation with each other and make sense of, or make meaning out of it? These are the famous ruins of the Windsor plantation, which have become kind of iconic image of the lost cause, and they became tourist attractions because they stood for nostalgia for an ancient and noble past. No matter that the columns constructed by enslaved people of African descent were completed in 1861. So the war had already started, and they were destroyed not by the war, but by a fire in 1890. But nonetheless, they become kind of stand-ins, right? Little quotation marks that are supposed to take us back to the Old South. And this was another tourist attraction in the American South that featured ruins. This is Longwood Plantation, which was constructed in 1859 for a planter, and this construction was halted in 1861. And it's been preserved this way as a tourist attraction because these houses in disrepair were another opportunity to infuse the lost cause interpretation of the Civil War with stories of personal drama and material loss. A tourist wrote, "Perhaps no home in Natchez country makes a greater appeal to the imagination or brings home more strongly the tragedy of the war between the states than Longwood, a tragic reminder of shattered hopes and frustrated dreams." So tourists here are asked to bemoan the planters' abruptly interrupted lives and the loss of a plantation way of life, right? One person's tragedy is another person's liberation, and one person's nostalgia is another person's tragedy. So I'm going to skip all of this because we're really way over time. And so maybe if you wanted to have conversations about some of these, I will very much do that. But I'm going to conclude rather abruptly by just jumping to the end, because we have, I don't want to try your patience too much more. I'm thinking again about how we might see monuments in the everyday landscape, and think about the everyday landscape as a kind of monument to a certain kind of understanding of the past, right? And to interrogate our everyday landscape the way we do monuments, okay? And I'm sharing with you the work of Rachel Whiteread. This was a temporary public sculpture in East London. It's cast in concrete. It won her various prizes. It's a concrete, well, I'll explain in a minute, but you can kind of get the picture. This was a Victorian terrace house, originally constructed for an elite or noble class, but then adapted as high-density housing for working class people. And eventually, by the 80s and 90s, it was slated for demolition. You can see it's the only one standing, part of a larger plan by the government to tear down dilapidated buildings to create more green space for the community. And this last one was vacated by a person who had been evicted after a years-long fight. And so this artist cast the walls from the inside, supported by a metal interior, and then she removed the exterior of the house and created this brutalist mass in the empty space where the structure used to be. And it looks like a nondescript brutalist mass, but there are touches of domesticity. And from another perspective, you can kind of see it as small and vulnerable against the towering high-rises looming in the distance. And I want to end with this because I want to just bring you back to my own development as a thinker, because you all are now in the moment where you're figuring out your path. And I want to just encourage you to use your own biographies to think about what are the ways you think? What are the tools that feel comfortable in your metaphorical hand? What are the languages you want to use to express yourself, right? And I'm not just talking about linguist languages. I'm talking about all kinds of languages of human endeavor. And I'm just thinking about my own childhood as a source of my questions. The redlining map of Manhattan shows that this area over here, all the way to the west, where it says Section 2, downtown Manhattan, all of that is redline, okay? That was a neighborhood that was immigrant, Jewish, Italian, African-American, and eventually, by the 40s, especially Puerto Rican. Some of you may heard of the musical West Side Story. The neighborhood that takes place in was an actual neighborhood that eventually was destroyed through urban renewal. And I grew up in that big high rise behind that tiny little tenement building. And every day as a child, we were talking earlier, Blaine and I, about when did you sort of start becoming aware of the idea of history, that things have a history and there is change over time. I used to walk by this tenement building every day. And I'm sure all of you have a story like this because you're here. So something in you cares about space and cares about how people use space, right? And I walk by this every day, and I was not an architectural historian. I didn't know from the dumbbell tenement, but I knew that that side of the building was not meant to be visible somehow, right? Even a child can sort of understand that that rough-hewn side and the air shaft, that these are not meant to be viewed. And I thought, oh my goodness, if this wasn't meant to be viewed, that meant there has to have been another building here next to it. And if there was another building here next to it, well, maybe there was another and another and another. And oh my gosh, maybe this was a whole row of buildings. And I'm living there, right? And then I started wondering, well, how, why? Well, so the whole area was taken out with varying tools of eminent domain, and this family refused to sell. And the designers of the building I grew up in had to change their whole plan. So instead of a mega block, they had to make an L around the building. And I grew up on this space that was, had this historical evidence of memorializing the mundane. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is I don't mean memorializing in the way of necessarily lifting up every story from the past, but how can we see the everyday landscape, the mundane landscape, the things we take for granted as expressions of an historical narrative, so that we can ask ourselves, how are our surroundings the product of historical choices? And how have the historical narratives that we've convinced ourselves legitimate the landscape? And how does the landscape in turn help, in our mind, make the current conditions seem to be static, natural, and unchanging? If you can perceive the juxtapositions and clues of the past in your physical landscape, you're going to be able to take in the context of what you're doing in a much more socially just way. So thank you for listening for 75 minutes, and I am finished with my talk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Reiko, very much. We've got time for a few questions. So if you guys remember how it works. All right, I see Matthew raising his head very strongly over there. So tell us your name and tell us, who you are.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Matthew Jin. I'm one of the architectural historians here, so it's a pleasure to welcome a fellow historian of the built environment. I teach a class that deals with and brings students in contact with sites of trauma, particularly enslaved burial grounds. And the class culminates in the design collectively with descendants and other community stakeholders of a memorial to mark these spaces and the violence and the absences that they represent. And it's come to sort of my attention in the process of working on this project that it is not enough to tear down. Tearing down is in some ways essential, right? That statue of Robert E. Lee needed to come down, but to tear down is not enough. And so I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about where you see the most interesting and impactful and critical directions for intervening. What are those in terms of remaking our monument landscape? And I think that's a sort of important set of insights in terms of where history meets design, because I'm always getting my students to try and think at that intersection. So again, it would be great to hear from you about what do you see as being the most impactful means of intervention? Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I've been thinking about this a lot because I was asked to be on a committee that would help us think about what to do with the 5 toppled monuments in our own city. And it was a committee that was convened by the city. And we did a ton of research about best practices elsewhere. And I can share with you that report because I can't honestly remember, specific examples from specific cities off the top. But I will also tell you that after months of work, the city just didn't do anything with the report. So beware of, how much effort you put into these ideas. Yeah, bureaucracy and politics and business leaders and the Chamber of Commerce and all of that, like they just want to have the monuments back up, So one of the things I guess that we emphasized was precisely like not necessarily to just take them down or just to replace them, but to use the event of the monument controversy as opportunities to start conversations about broader questions of historical memory, historical reckoning, social inequality, the politics of public space. And so we were trying to think about different scales and methods of intervention. One included trying to develop school curricula so that a school would start to research the history of its own site, and also whom are they named after? What is the history of that person? And can this group of students, maybe design new monuments or develop on the high school level or college level walking tours, or develop QR codes to look at sites or talk about sites that aren't even existing there anymore. But the idea was very much not only to have a group of people design something that would go in its place, but to actually use the debates around the monuments to start longer lasting conversations that would go far beyond the physical monument itself. So we're trying to think about acts of repair. So like this Cleo Davis, who is installing historical markers in the red-lined neighborhoods of Portland that are now being gentrified. He's also involved in archiving the local high school, which for decades has been predominantly African-American, but is quickly losing that population as folks get pushed out to the outskirts and a gentrified class comes in. And so there's an archiving project. I think that memory has to include not just physical sites, and of course we're emphasizing the built environment here, but any opportunity to archive, any opportunity to take oral histories, any opportunity to collect documents, to tell a story in multifaceted ways. I think we need all the different languages: the design world, the historical research, the storytelling aspect. Bringing in community engaged theater, devised theater, to have community members. In Portland, we have something called the Vanport Mosaic, which is a place and memory making project, they call themselves. And they emerge out of the town of Vanport, which was a really large, basically, one of those instant cities that goes up during World War II, that was constructed and meant to be temporary, and it housed thousands of Black and white war workers. And then there was a flood, and because Black people were the only people living there after the war, not the only, but they had limited other access to different real estate markets, since they were still living in this shoddily constructed temporary city. So when a flood came, their entire community was destroyed, and then they get pressed into this North Albina neighborhood. So Vanport Mosaic is committed to not just sort of spatial justice, but also to storytelling and theater, and trying to engage memory in multifaceted ways, and not just sort of fixate on the monument itself. Other questions? Yes. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I'm the
Sorry, I'm not keeping up here. Just, you don't have to stand up, but just give us your name and who you are. And ask the
Okay.
question.
Hello, my name is Lauren Fleming. I am a second-year architecture major. Last summer, I visited Martha's Vineyard, and you may or may not be familiar with Oak Bluff, which is the fundamental resort of Black wealth, Black communities, Black higher education, and Black culture. As a young African-American woman who grew up in an upper middle and highly educated Black family, would you describe Oak Bluff as a solidifier of Black monumental success in modern America?
I missed a word. Would I consider Oak Bluff?
Oak Bluff as a solidifier of Black monumental success in monumental America, in modern America.
Yes. I'm not familiar with it as much as you are. You know more about it than I do. I'm only vaguely familiar because I grew up in the Northeast, and but it's not a history I'm particularly familiar with. But I think any history that's going to be celebrating marginalized voices and the successes of folks who have traditionally been excluded from triumphal narratives, I think is an excellent story. I mean, absolutely. And I think that it would be a source of pride. And I wonder too, with places like that, what would happen if that became a tourist attraction? And does tourism, actually kind of intrinsically distort the story or commodify the story, right? Because on the one, and I think that's probably one of the trickiest questions for people in the preservation world and so forth, is if you want to disseminate the history, you might be a victim of your own success, right? Because the farther reach you want, the more visitors you want to learn that history, the more you might be dependent on these sort of outside consumers to direct the story. So I guess the question is that a history they're just telling to each other, or is that a history that they want spread? I don't know. Excellent. Black wealth and higher education. Any other?
Okay, who else? All right, one in the back.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm an undergrad first year student. My question was, I guess originally it was related to the work you did on incarceration, but it can also apply to what you talked about most in this presentation. Have you had experience? Because obviously there's a lot of groups, whether it is people who celebrate the Confederacy or neo-Nazis, or for the incarceration, if it's politicians supported by, or lobbyists who, support politicians, or it's the private prison industry. Have you ever experienced pushback, whether it's attempts to silence you, or kind of like unfaithful straw man arguments that are trying to discredit your work? Have you ever experienced anything like that that aimed to kind of push you out of the dialogue?
I have been very lucky. No, I mean, I'm in a bubble. I have not yet had that kind of pushback. But I will say this, that the work that I'm doing right now, that is scholarship on the history of prison practices and how the relationship between incarcerated people and the free world has changed over time. That's the subject of my current book. But it was inspired by work in the prison class, in the Inside Out class. And I guess I would just say to such a person that two things. One, it's important to know the history. Whatever you think is normal and natural is recent, contested, contingent, and made. So the things that we think are common sense or political suicide or just sort of like unchangeable, whatever that Overton window is, we can always move it. Right? And so I think an historical perspective often offers that, because if you can look at other times and places when things were different or when people fought back, you're not just like learning lessons from the past, you are also recognizing the more sort of basic existential fact that the conditions that we're in were made, they are changeable, they are not static, okay? So that's my broad comment. But then the second thing would be a more personal comment, which is go inside and talk to people. Go to prison and look at an incarcerated person in the eye. Talk to them for 5 minutes and your mind will change. That we have to find, I think, that balance between scholarly structural analysis and see the world beyond the immediate skills and places where we invest ourselves, right? But also personal interconnection and human connection. And that once we can build spaces that foster that, then we will no longer so easily surrender to the idea that entire groups of people are disposable. We would not continue to believe that if we had more opportunities to connect and engage, right? We can get susceptible to fear mongering because we have been told that the boundaries between us are there to, protect our very lives. And that is not the case. So don't believe it.
Thank you.
Okay, who else?
Hi, my name is Bailey Nestor. I'm a first year. So us first years over spring break, we went to Washington, D.C. and visited a lot of monuments, a lot of memorials. And I was paying attention throughout your presentation how you spoke about them being removed or taken down or put somewhere else. For example, like Robert E. Lee was removed obviously for like the acts that he's done and the things that he did in a negative light. But people like Thomas Jefferson who still have their memorials, but also committed like terrible, heinous things when you think about him and Sally and like things like that. How would you say is a good way to go about fixing these memorials that are still maybe brushing over like negative impacts that they
Right,
did?
well, a memorial by definition brushes over, right? Because it is not a human expression of a real human being. I mean, it precisely can't. The genre is precisely static. I don't want to say two-dimensional because literally it's not two-dimensional, right? But it's metaphorically two-dimensional, right? It is freezing a person in time to celebrate a thing, right? Now, everybody has different lines about, I'm never going to watch the movies of so-and-so again once I found out that he committed this crime, or I don't, let's deplatform this one or that one. Everyone is going to have sort of a different litmus test about what they'll sort of tolerate. And there is a kind of slippery slope idea about, well, if Jeb Stuart, then what about Thomas Jefferson? I think one good rule of thumb is, what is this person being memorialized for? Thomas Jefferson is a really complex person, and I am not ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's me. There is a lot to learn, not least of which was his incredible internal sort of theorization about race. This is a person who could not square his belief in democracy with the system of slavery and struggled with it. I'm not saying that's a tragedy. I'm saying, he enslaved people and benefited from that. But there are writings and thinkings and, revolutionary thought that he has left that I am prepared to celebrate. So to me, the question is, what is the monument celebrating? What is this person known for? If what you are being celebrated for and known for is the enslavement of other people, then I don't want that monument. If you are known for and celebrated for maybe a variety of other things and you're a problematic human like all of us, well, then let's start a conversation about the complexity of this person. I don't know how you necessarily do that at a monument. I'm not saying, the QR codes and walking tours are the answer to everything, but I do not think that we want to go into a kind of extreme sort of censorship where we are missing out on the complexity and flawed nature of the human endeavor and sort of all of the different sort of knowledge production and creative production that people over the years have to offer us. And we can study it critically and understand his context. And if people want to remove the monument, that's fine. But I'm not ready to say Jefferson bad because he owned slaves. I'm sorry, I'm not ready to say that. Just don't put that on Twitter. No. Out of context. Or you don't even use Twitter. You're 19 years old. You're like over Twitter, right? You're doing like
Awesome. All right.
TikTok. Don't put it on TikTok. Okay.
Yeah. There you
Right.
go. All right. We got one around here. Let's see. I'm going to come around from the back. Okay, wait, put your hand up again. Sorry, there you go. All right.
And I guess I'll say one more thing, and this may sound cheesy, but it's totally sincere. I study in prisons or study prisons and study with prisoners because I believe that people are more than the worst thing they've ever done. And that applies to Thomas Jefferson. We still have something to learn from even people who've done horrible things.
Hi, my name is Hillary. I'm an undergrad second year, and I was just wondering, how do you recommend as learning architects we treat space that has such a loaded past? For
Ooh.
example, with plantations and slave quarters,
Ooh.
once you remove the slave quarters off the grounds, do you rebuild? Do you preserve the space? Like, I think there's a dichotomy that sits with placing new things on those grounds. Do you have a recommendation or an insight for what to do with that kind of space?
What do you think?
I don't know.
That's okay. I don't know either. But I don't necessarily have recommendations, and I'm really not an expert in this. I mean, I haven't, been part of any real decisions. I just get to sit and think and teach and talk about this stuff with students and sometimes write about it. But I think the first thing would have to be to involve the community and to involve the descendants of the people who are involved in whatever the historical narrative or the proportion of the historical narrative you're talking about, right? You have to have community input and multiple voices precisely going out of your way in an affirmative sense to lift up people whose voices have been silenced, right? A kind of epistemic shutting down, right? And also, I mean, for my personal taste, I like a juxtaposition. I like to see something that acknowledges change over time. I'm a historian, and even when you have like a house museum, are you going to do it like the Paul Revere house where everything is frozen in 1772? Or are you going to take into account that over the century after he lived there, the neighborhood turned into an Italian and Jewish neighborhood, and that the building that was Paul Revere's house was also an Italian bank, right? Can you fold that in so that we can both honor Paul Revere and that history and experience the remarkable fact that this thing still stands and it serves again as a touchstone to our memory to be in that physical space? But can we also not freeze it at that moment? Can we understand the change over time, the conflict over the preservation of the house, the anti-immigrant sentiment that was levied at the neighbors who were letting the house fall into disrepair, right? And it had to be put in the hands of capable, matrons of society. On a plantation, it's much harder. But does it have to be about real estate development? Can it be a place of repair? Can it be a place of reparation? Can it be a place of returning theft? Can it be a site that, so here's an example. I was gonna just show you this and we didn't have time. And, I don't know what you think of this. This is not necessarily something that I am endorsing, but this artist, Cameron Rowland, he's an African-American artist. And one of his main concerns is challenging the art market itself. And the idea of depreciation. And this is the piece of art called Depreciation. It engages with the legal regime of property in the United States as one that is founded on slavery and colonization. And the art piece itself is a set of documents that record the purchase of an area of land and on Edisto Island, South Carolina. This was an area of land that was among the land that was promised to formerly enslaved people under the short-lived 40 acres and a mule plan that was then aborted by President Johnson. So there was that brief moment of possibility for redistribution and repair. But President Johnson returned that ordered the return of lands to the Confederate owners, forcing formerly enslaved people who were, hoping to be able to sustain themselves on that land into a sharecropping system in order to survive. And so he's asking a question, Cameron Rowland, can we imagine a piece of land that is outside the real estate market? So what he did was he bought that piece of land, removed everything on that land, and he builds nothing on that land. So the deeds of sale, photographs of an overgrown lot, and the long caption reads, "This land was purchased at market value on August 6, 2018 by 8060 Maxey Road, Incorporated, a nonprofit company formed for the sole purpose of buying this land and recording a restrictive covenant on its use." Okay, so you all know what a restrictive covenant is. He's using it and he's turning it on its side. This covenant has as its explicit purpose the restriction of all development and use of the property by the owner. The property is now appraised at zero. By rendering it legally unusable, this restrictive covenant eliminates the market value of the land. These restrictions run with the land regardless of the owner. As such, they will last indefinitely. As reparation, this covenant asks how land might exist outside the legal economic regime of property that was instituted by slavery and colonization. Rather than redistributing the property, the restriction imposed on 80/60 Maxi Road status as valuable and transactable real estate asserts antagonism to the regime of property as a means of reparation. So that's one intervention, right? Take it out of the real estate market, drain its value and say, you know, F you to the real estate value. Okay, and he sees that as a reparation. Other people might say, well, that's a tremendous waste. Like what a luxury that is for an artist to drain the value of property. Why can't you make housing there? What, you know, I mean, it really depends what the needs are of the community, and you know, what kinds of voices and disciplines you involve. Okay, oh,
Okay.
there was a hand
All
here.
right. So I see one more in the back, and I think that's going to have to be the last question because we're
We have one in
starting.
the front too.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
I will
those
be
of you, I
short,
know
and
some of
hopefully
you
it'll be a
need to
question I
go.
can't answer, and
So
I'll-
you can,
I
you can
can't
head
finish
out if you
making
need
things
to,
up.
but
Anyway.
we want to answer as many as possible.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Devin Pina. I am a practicing architect and I'm one of the teachers for the first year studio. I have a question, but I was thinking about what you were saying. This presentation was really educational for a lot, and I think it's really important. The work you're doing is so important. I appreciate you coming out here to share it with us. And being yourself unapologetically, like it adds to it. And I appreciate that. And I think it's important for non-Black voices to carry this story so that non-Black ears can hear it as well. Unfortunately, sometimes that, well, maybe the word isn't unfortunately, but it can legitimize the kind of history when it's not coming from the people who experience the history themselves. And that can kind of move the mark forward. I was just thinking about what you were saying with the, like if it was like take it down every Thomas Jefferson memorial because he owned slaves, as that being a form of censorship. And it just made me think about like even keeping them up in a sense as what they represent is a form of censorship too. So it's a very
Yes.
tough conversation in that regard. I was one of the instructors that took the students to DC, and we went to the African American History Museum and learned about Benjamin Banneker, who was a Black person who was urging Thomas Jefferson to change his views on Africans. So I think African Americans are formerly enslaved or enslaved Africans in general, because he also had views on that people of African descent were inferior. So not only was it just, you know what I mean? It's like a bigger
Yes,
story than just how like a memorial doesn't
Yeah.
just, you know, represent the part, like the only thing, his only owning slaves wasn't his only interaction of like, oh, this is what makes him bad. So I think it's like there needs to be a bigger, like a fuller picture. And then that just talks about like why, you know, making monuments to like
Yeah.
a single person in general, and like a bigger discourse on that. But my question is more about like just thinking of like the solutions that we have now, as far as like you mentioned with the prison system, making kind of the, you know, stories be told and humanizing people and telling stories. And I think all of these are what these kind of modern digitized and like modern memorials will be. But what does you know, that's the kind of impetus of the architectural historian, but for the architectural futurist and the just people in general in design who want to make impact for the future, not just by telling stories and then the stories are recorded, like using the built environment and informing the built environment. Like it seems like, you know, gentrification is just this ongoing, it's not going to stop. So what are the ways? I think I lean towards thinking in policy change, but how can we empower students to think along those lines of how they can affect the built environment and the future of these disenfranchised communities?
Yeah, just a quick note on Jefferson. There are thinkers lately who are saying there should be no such thing as monuments, because you can't ever, you know, trust that any set of values or any person is going to have sort of permanent universal appeal, and that whatever monuments are going to come up, they're going to be defaced or knocked down eventually. And so, one wants to think about questioning the form of monument itself. Like, what counts as a monument? Do we even want to have them? Is there any such thing as having something like as a really permanent, ennobling fixture of all values for all time? I mean, it's a challenging question. And the one you ask, your last point or question is enormous. And so I don't know that I can be so useful except in a really general way, which again, I think is to just think about, I mean, you all need historians. And I'm not just talking about architectural historians, I'm talking about historians of the place. What land are you standing on? Whose land are you standing on? Who was here before? Every empty lot used to be something before. Under every pavement, there's something. Under that, there's something. And there are generations of injustice and justice and struggle baked into those very places. There is no such thing as a tabula rasa, right? People were there, people are there, right? That even empty derelict structures may house people, even defunct looking neighborhoods, people still live there, right? To not just look at space, as something raw and uninhabited and inanimate, but to look at it as a container of ghosts, and to think about whose bones am I standing on? How can I do justice? How can I take that into account when I build, right? Because you're not making something in a vacuum. So that's why I think stories matter, just informing yourself about the place and how can the thing I build be an act of repair. There's always going to be something to repair, right? Because capitalism. So if you are you about to build something, right? I think instead of thinking of it as a blank slate, think about spatial justice in the present. By spatial justice, I'm thinking about access to space and the resources that accrue and the social and political and economic capital that accrue from access to those spaces. So thinking about spatial justice in the present, right? What kind of values do I want to express? Whom do I want to serve? But also, how is that tied to legacy? You are not doing anything you're doing in a vacuum. So what came before? And is there a way that I can make my construction or design an act of repair? That's pretty much all I can say about that right now.
Okay, and I guess there was one last one down in front. Okay, and this will be, we will wrap it up.
Sorry, there we go. You touched on it a little bit with the last question, actually, but I'm not an architecture student. I'm interested in a career in planning, and I was wondering a career in planning, specifically regarding like zoning or maybe economic planning. But we talked a bit, and Charlotte has such a history of this, of gentrification and urban renewal, doing harm to like the community, most of the people who live here. Do you have any examples or things that have stood out to you that you've noticed of ways of doing things that serve and retain the people who already live there? I just don't see as many examples of ways to do this right. And I know that has a lot to do with like existing power
and that doesn't mean they don't
structures.
exist. It just means I'm not aware.
Any
And I
cool
should be,
ideas?
because it's, what's that?
Any cool ideas, I guess, for ways we could do things differently?
I mean, there has to be some kind of incremental, achievable material steps towards the more fantastical goal of rethinking the whole idea of property values, right? I mean, I just think that we worship property values, and there are other values besides property values. And there's a certain kind of language that we speak that we have come to take for granted. And I think that one of the definitions of ideology is that it's so invisible. It's the water you're in if you're a fish, right? You don't know that you're swimming in water. You can't even identify it as an ideology. In other words, you can't identify it as a certain perspective on the world alongside other possible perspectives. And one of the ways you recognize this, I'm not saying, go out and have children, is when you have to explain to a child why there are people sleeping on the street. Try explaining that to a child. And when there's vacant housing, right? And when you have, or explain race for that matter, like when you're forced to actually explain something that doesn't make any sense to a child, you start to recognize the ways in which we've convinced ourselves of the inevitability of only one way of organizing our universe and our resources and each other. And so I do think that, absent any examples from me, which is unfortunate, that finding those examples is absolutely key. And they might be historical examples, right? They might be like the sharecroppers union, tenant uprising against eviction in the 1930s, which created a cooperative town along a main highway so that the world could see that they were suffering, and they created a kind of mutual aid that was, again, outside of the real estate market. I think mutual aid is key, and looking to what places are doing is key, but I also think looking to the past is key, not only for lessons of specific ideas, but just to disrupt our thinking about what's possible, right? Because it's only when we see other examples that we recognize that our way isn't the only way. I don't have other good examples, and I should have, and you're going to make me think about it. And that wasn't the focus of my talk, but I should be prepared next time for such a question. And if you know of examples, please tell me. But, there are efforts at like this Albina Vision Trust, for example. I can't say it's successful because it's just started. But they are trying to take all this vacant car-centric land and do what you would call sort of new urbanist infill kind of stuff. But they're doing it with an eye towards specifically serving the displaced or formerly displaced community. So they're involving all those folks and the descendants of those folks and inviting historical researchers to like track down who were the displaced families, who was the most harm. It's like a direct repair. And then also having kind of a holistic idea of development so that there's community centers and educational opportunities and theater and arts and so that it's fully vibrant in all aspects of human life, human necessity. All right.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, I think those are some great examples. I would say look at cooperative development models. Those are
Cooperative dwelling, yes.
those are really starting to come up again, where instead of real estate, for example, being individualistic, you have community groups, organizations, neighborhoods that come together to develop in ways that help redistribute some of both the power and then also the capital resources toward
But
development.
right, like there's
So
so
that's-
much about displacement that is, we think about mobility often as a sign of freedom, right? But often coerced mobility is a sign of your vulnerability, right? And when people get displaced, there is obviously a total kind of disruption. So it's not to say new people can never move in, right? You can't say that, right? But is there a way to ensure that the people who want to stay can stay? Can you have, can we redefine definitions of blight? Can we give folks the tools and the capital to repair their own houses? Can we get rid of laws that have to do with how tall your grass has to be and whether or not you can have a defunct car in your front yard? I mean, all kinds of ways that zoning is used to discriminate and eradicate undesirable people. So it's not this neutral thing, right? Zoning. It's had an incredibly useful history as a way of offering, a sense of public health, but it's also been used in insidious ways to quarantine and control certain groups of people. So yeah, I think histories of zoning and histories of cooperative living outside those kinds of frameworks is the key. Okay.
Great. Okay. Well, let's have a round of applause. Thank you. All right. Thank you. And let's get to class, everybody.